There is a stretch of fence line on a cattle farm in Pendleton County, West Virginia, that no member of that family has crossed after dark since the summer of 1962. The fence runs along the lower edge of a wooded hollow on the north end of the property, where cleared pasture meets the first row of red oak and sugar maple climbing toward the ridge. For 47 years, the arrangement held. It held because the things the family patriarch identified in his private journals as dogmen had made clear to him, in a single encounter during his 42nd summer, what the boundary meant and what it would cost anyone who stopped respecting it. On the night of June 14th, 2009, his grandson learned that cost firsthand. What the security camera mounted on the equipment shed captured between midnight and 3 in the morning that night is the reason the timber crew working the North Hollow quit their contract 4 days later. The footage shows multiple dogmen moving along the lower pasture fence line. What they are doing in it is not what you expect from a simple territorial predator. Once you understand the 60-year history that preceded that night, what you are watching becomes far more difficult to process than a straightforward attack would be.
Quick thing before we move on, I have this book coming out. It's called the DOGMEN Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
Pendleton County sits against the Virginia state line in the eastern part of West Virginia, almost entirely enclosed by the Allegheny Mountains. The county holds about 6,700 people across 342 square miles, fewer than 20 people per square mile, which puts it in the range of terrain that most of the country's population never encounters. Most residents live in or near Franklin, the county seat, a small river town on the south branch of the Potomac, at just under 700 people. Outside Franklin, the population is scattered across communities like Riverton, Upper Tract, and Sugar Grove, and across the farms that occupy the valley floors and the wider limestone basins pressed between the ridges. The ridges themselves rise to 4,000 feet and higher above the farms, forested from valley floor to ridgetop, and they connect without meaningful interruption to the Monongahela National Forest, which covers most of the eastern West Virginia highlands and extends into terrain that has not changed in any fundamental way in centuries. Germany Valley is one of those limestone basins. It runs roughly 7 miles in a northeast to southwest direction and reaches about 2 miles across at its widest point, pressed in by forested ridges on almost every side. North Fork Mountain forms the eastern wall, a quartzite ridge that runs for nearly 20 miles along the county's eastern edge, so steep on its eastern face that the main highway curves around its base rather than attempting to cross it. To the west and northwest, the terrain climbs towards Spruce Knob, the highest point in West Virginia at 4,863 feet, which sits at the center of the Monongahela National Forest. Between these ridges, Germany Valley holds some of the most productive agricultural land in the county. Limestone underlies the basin, which gives the soil a fertility that the thin, acidic ground on the surrounding slopes cannot match. German-speaking settlers found it in the mid-18th century and recognized it immediately. The farms they established in the 1740s and 1750s have been worked almost continuously since. The family that concerns this story has farmed in Germany Valley since the early 1920s. They were not the first family on that ground, but they have been the most persistent, running cattle through periods that pushed many neighbors off the land entirely. The farm covers a little over 340 acres in its current configuration. The lower portion, the fields on the valley floor, is fenced for cattle grazing. Above the fields, where the terrain steepens toward the ridge, there is timber, black cherry, sugar maple, red oak, and yellow poplar, selectively logged in the past but not recently harvested. At the top of the property, where the slope becomes severe and the soil thins, the farm boundary meets the Monongahela National Forest, and the forest runs unbroken from there through terrain that most people who drive Route 33 through the valley will never enter. The North Hollow is a drainage feature on the upper portion of the farm. It is a fold in the hillside where a seasonal creek runs after rain and where the forest canopy is dense enough to keep the ground shaded for most of the day, even in July. From the lower pasture looking uphill, the hollow appears as a depression in the forested slope, darker than the surrounding timber, quiet in the way that deep hollows in the Alleghenies are quiet. a stillness that has its own particular weight, different from the silence of open ground. For most of its documented history, the hollow served no productive function in the farm's operation. Too steep for cattle, too dense for easy equipment access. The land use maps the county keeps on file show it as unclassified timber and have shown it that way for the entire period for which records exist. In the family's understanding of the property across 3 generations, the North Hollow was the part of the farm you left alone. The man whose account forms the center of this story is the grandson of the man who made that decision. We will call him Arlo. That is not his real name. He asked that we use a different one, and his reasoning was practical. Pendleton County has about 6,700 people, Germany Valley considerably fewer, and his family's name has been attached to the same piece of ground for 3 generations. A pseudonym provides limited protection in a community that small, but it provides permission to tell the story at all. We spoke by telephone over the course of several months. He provided copies, not originals, of his grandfather Emmett's journals, which he keeps in a fireproof cabinet in his home office, along with photographs from the period between 2009 and 2012, documenting the 3 years after the arrangement his grandfather had maintained was broken. Emmett was born in Pendleton County in 1920. He completed his formal schooling through the 8th grade in Franklin and spent the balance of his education on the land with his father, learning to read weather, soil, timber, and animal behavior the way farming men in those mountains learned such things, by proximity and practice, and being told when you were wrong. He married a woman named Ida from a neighboring farm family in the valley in 1942. He was drafted shortly after and served 2 years in the Pacific. He came home in 1945 to a farm that Ida and her father had maintained in his absence, and that was producing well enough to suggest the next generation had a future on it. His son Lowell was born in '46. Emmett ran the cattle operation until the late 1970s, when arthritis in both hands made the sustained physical work impossible to maintain at the pace he had kept his whole career. He handed the farm to Lowell in 1979 and spent his remaining years doing what he could manage, fencing by hand, keeping the equipment records, reading, and writing in the series of bound notebooks that Arlo now keeps locked in his office. Emmett died in 1989. He left behind a cattle operation, a land holding that had held its value through every economic turn the county had made in 60 years and 37 years of journals. Lowell ran the farm from 1979 until his death in the spring of 2009. 30 years of cattle operations in a county where the margins of farming were never comfortable and where the pressure to sell or consolidate was a constant backdrop to every season's work. He and his wife Vera had 2 children. Arlo was the older of the 2. He grew up on the farm, left for Davis and Elkins College in Elkins to study agricultural management, came back in the early 1990s and worked the land alongside his father, and then alone from that point forward. He knows the property in the physical, unreflective way that comes from 3 decades of daily contact. He can read what the pasture tells him about cattle health, read the tree line for weather building in off the ridge, read the patterns of sound from the hollow above the fence line for the particular kind of quiet that means something worth paying attention to is happening up there. He had developed all of that fluency years before he understood what the hollow's particular quiet actually signified. Lowell tried to give Arlo the full picture of the North Hollow during the years they worked the farm together. He started in Arlo's mid-20s, which is when Lowell decided his son was old enough to hear the complete version of what Emmett had written and what Lowell had seen with his own eyes across 3 decades on the land. Arlo received the practical details without difficulty. He understood that there were large, unusual animals in the hollow, animals that were unlike anything in the standard West Virginia wildlife catalog, animals that had occupied that section of the property for as long as the family had been there and probably longer. He understood the rules that governed the family's relationship with the hollow. The north fence line was the limit, and you did not cross it after dark or send livestock up there, and you accepted losses at the upper fence as the cost of not having problems in the lower pastures. He could follow those rules without questioning them, the way you follow things you grow up with. What he held loosely, what he could hear but could not fully carry, was the interpretive weight behind the rules. The idea of a sustained multi-decade territorial arrangement between his grandfather and a population of intelligent, undocumented creatures required a kind of belief that his rational mind sat at a slight distance from the practical facts. He accepted what he was told. He did not know it the way Lowell knew it. That distance cost him. Emmett's journals cover the years from 1950 through 1987. They are practical documents, records that a working farmer keeps because a working farm generates information worth tracking. Weather patterns, cattle weights by season, equipment failures and repairs, breeding dates and calving records, observations about the condition of fences, fields, and timber. They are written in a hand that is careful rather than elegant, in the series of bound notebooks that Arlo now has, and they were meant to be useful rather than read. Across 37 years, the entries are almost uniformly brief, a few lines per day when there was something to note, blank days when there was not. There is one entry, dated July 9th, 1962, that runs 3 full pages. In 37 years of daily journals, it is the only entry of that length that does not concern the death of a family member or a catastrophic loss to the herd. It begins with a routine notation. A heifer, a 2-year-old he had ear-tagged the previous spring, had broken through the north fence sometime during the night of July 7th and had not returned by morning. He found the gap in the fence on the morning of July 8th. Spent that day and the following morning tracking her. The trail led uphill, into the hollow. The hollow in July is dense. Ground cover comes knee-high in the moist soil along the drainage, and the overhead canopy closes thickly enough to reduce the light below what you might expect on a clear summer day. The temperature drops several degrees below the open pasture below. Emmett had been into the hollow before, for firewood and for fence maintenance along the upper property boundary. He was not worried going in that morning. He was irritated about the heifer and focused on the track, which was clear in the soft soil along the seasonal creek bed. He followed it uphill for about a quarter mile. He found the heifer lying on her side in a small flat area beside the creek, roughly 100 yards below the upper fence line. He could see the wrong angle of her neck from 15 feet away. He got close enough to examine the wound and found what he describes in the journal as a clean break. No claw marks across the hide, no tearing, none of the disorganized damage a black bear produces on a fresh carcass. She had been killed precisely, in a way that removed only what was needed. The meat along the hindquarters had been taken with a neatness that he spent some time standing there trying to account for. He went through the available explanations, and none of them fit the damage pattern he was looking at. Then, he heard a sound from the tree line above the flat area. He describes it as a low exhalation, not a vocalization in any conventional sense, a breath under pressure, the sound a large animal makes when it shifts its weight or changes its position, and the effort forces air out through the body. He looked up toward the tree line. At the edge of the timber, approximately 40 feet from where he was standing, a figure was standing on 2 legs. Emmett's description in the journal is deliberate and specific. He was a farmer who had spent his life around large animals, and who made a professional distinction between what he could identify with certainty and what he could not. He writes that the figure was standing fully upright, the way a person stands, with the weight distributed across the stance. It was large. He estimated the height against the gap between the nearest trees at better than 7 feet, and the shoulder width against the equipment shed door, which he notes was approximately 3 feet wide, as roughly equal. The head was wrong. The face extended forward from the skull in a way that had no human equivalent, a muzzle projecting several inches forward, ears standing erect on the top of the skull and pointing slightly forward. The fur was dark, close to black, heavy through the chest and down the arms. The posture was slightly forward-leaning, weight on the balls of the feet, balanced in a way that communicated readiness without communicating aggression. He writes that he reached for the rifle on his shoulder. Then he stopped, because there was a second one. The second figure was at the far edge of the flat area, near the creek, and it was noticeably smaller than the first, still large in an absolute sense, but clearly a different individual, a different size class. Then, at the limit of Emmett's sightline through the understory behind the second figure, there was a third. Emmett writes it this way. The third one was a pup, smaller than either, probably not half the size of the big one. It was staying behind the second one the way a calf stays behind its mother when something has come into the pasture. I stood there and I looked at that and I put the rifle back on my shoulder. 3 of them. A large adult at the forward edge of the flat area. A second adult, smaller, positioned between the first and the juvenile. The juvenile staying in close cover behind the second adult. A family group was managing a threat, the man with the rifle, in exactly the way a family group manages a threat, with the largest member forward and the youngest member protected. Emmett had spent his entire working life reading how cattle arranged themselves when they felt pressure from a predator or from an unfamiliar person. He recognized the formation. He put the rifle back on his shoulder. He stood in that hollow for what he describes as a long time. He does not estimate the duration. The large figure watched him without advancing. The second adult held its position. The juvenile stayed behind cover. None of the 3 made any move toward him, and none of them retreated. Then Emmett did what his reading of the situation told him to do. He turned around and walked back the way he came, facing forward, not running, and did not look behind him until he had put a full 100 yards of drainage between himself and the flat area. When he looked back, the area was empty. He walked back to the farmhouse and told Ida what he had found. He does not record her response in the journal. What he records is his own thinking, over the following 2.5 pages, and it is the most important document this family has ever produced. He writes, "These things have been on this land longer than I have. They were here when my father came here, and probably before that. They have left the house and the pastures alone, and I believe they will continue to do so as long as we leave them what they have. The heifer was at the top of the property. She went to them. I consider that my error and not theirs. The North Hollow is theirs. I will not go above the lower fence line after dark, and I will not send my family there. We will lose cattle occasionally at that fence line. That is the cost. What we get in return is that they stay out of the lower pastures, which they have always done. This is not a complicated arrangement. I am writing it down so that whoever has this land after me knows exactly what it is." The entry closes with 2 sentences. This is the deal. Hold to your side of it. He wrote that in July of 1962, for the next 47 years, the family held to their side, and from what the physical record shows, so did the creatures on the other side of the fence. What the arrangement looked like in practice across those 47 years is something Arlo assembled from Emmett's journals and from what Lowell had told him and from Lowell's own farm records. The specifics matter because they show the intelligence operating on both sides of the fence line with a consistency that rules out coincidence. The hollow boundary was never crossed by the creatures. In 47 years of Emmett's documentation, and then Lowell's own records, there is not a single incident of a dogman in the lower pastures or anywhere near the farmhouse. The upper fence line was the limit, and the creatures held to it without exception. Emmett tracked every livestock loss at the hollow fence from 1962 through the period when he handed the farm to Lowell. 31 losses total across approximately 20 years of active records, 23 cattle, 5 sheep in the early years before the family learned to keep small livestock off the upper portion of the property, and 3 goats that wandered into the buffer before the arrangement's logic was fully applied. Every loss occurred within 50 yards of the hollow fence. None occurred in the lower pastures, which were fully accessible from the forest margin of the farm and held the bulk of the herd. The creatures could have taken cattle anywhere on the property. They took them only at the line. What they left at the line is documented in the journals beginning in the first decade after the encounter. Deer carcasses. Roughly a dozen times over 20 years of Emmett's active records, he found deer that had been killed and placed on the hollow side of the fence near the boundary line, not dragged through the fence, not left at random, but placed with a deliberateness that was apparent in the positioning. The kills were clean, broken necks, the same method he had seen used on the heifer. The meat was partially consumed before the carcass was placed near the fence. In a 1969 entry, Emmett writes, "They leave what they don't need where I can find it. I take it away. I believe this is intentional." He does not speculate further. He accepted the exchange at the margin as part of the arrangement. Emmett documented the sounds consistently across 3 decades, 2 or 3 times per year, generally in late summer and early fall. The family would hear vocalizations from the direction of the hollow at night. His descriptions in the journals are consistent enough across 20-plus years to constitute a coherent portrait of what he was hearing. Low-frequency sounds that carried through the farmhouse walls rather than simply through the air. Sounds you felt before you consciously heard them. Structured patterns rather than random noise. One sequence answered from a different direction on the ridge by a second sequence, with variations that suggested exchange rather than solo vocalization. In a 1973 entry, Emmett writes that he had spent 30 years farming in those mountains and had heard every sound the forest made, and that what came from the hollow at night was not in that catalog. He tried and failed to match it to owls, bears, coyotes, or anything else he had. 30 years of experience identifying by sound. What he could say was that the sounds were organized and that they changed in character over the years in the same gradual way that any persistent acoustic presence changes, becoming familiar without becoming explicable. Lowell had 3 direct sightings across his 30 years running the property. He documented all 3. The first was in the summer of 1982, checking the upper fence line, when he saw 2 figures moving through the timber above the hollow, upright, dark-furred, crossing a gap in the canopy at a pace that covered ground in a way nothing he knew moved on 2 legs. He wrote, "What my father described, 2 of them, moving fast through the upper hollow. Did not approach, going about their business." The second was in the fall of '91, a single figure standing at the hollow edge at dusk, watching the lower pasture cattle for close to 10 minutes before turning back into the timber. He wrote, "Checking the herd, I think, not hunting, just looking." The third was in the early spring of 2004, when he went to check a water line and found a section that had been ice-blocked all winter already cleared. Standing at the spring box, he saw one of them in partial cover about 30 yards above him, watching him work. He finished the line check and walked back down. He wrote, "It was watching to make sure I was doing what I was supposed to be doing in the boundary area. I was. It left when I left. If you have spent time in Pendleton County, in the Germany Valley, or along the North Fork Mountain Corridor, or anywhere else in that part of the Alleghenies, I would like to hear from you in the comments. The reports I have been going through from that stretch of West Virginia go back considerably further than this family's records, and if you have had anything happen out there that you could not explain, that conversation belongs here." Lowell died of pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2009. The diagnosis came in January. The timeline from diagnosis to death was 3 months and 1 week, fast enough that the transfer of knowledge about the property, all of it, not just the practical farming knowledge, but the full weight of what Emmett had documented and what Lowell had observed across 30 years, happened in incomplete fragments. Lowell told Arlo to hold the North Hollow fence line. He said not to sell the timber rights up there, not under any circumstances. He said the things in the hollow were old enough that the arrangement Emmett made in 1962 was probably not the first understanding that piece of ground had seen. He said this plainly, from a hospital bed in Franklin, and Arlo sat with him and listened, and believed him in the way you believe your father, which is to say, completely and practically, without necessarily carrying the belief at the same depth the father carries it. 2 weeks after the funeral, a timber company based out of Elkins contacted Arlo by letter offering to purchase the cutting rights to the North Hollow. Approximately 62 acres of mature second-growth hardwood, black cherry and sugar maple and yellow poplar, estimated at close to 800,000 board feet. The offered price was $58,000. Arlo returned their call the following Monday. The decision was not careless. He needs that understood, and so do I. Arlo is not a man who dismissed his grandfather's journals or treated his father's warnings as superstition. He is a man who made a rational calculation under specific financial pressure, and whose capacity to honor the arrangement was diminished by the same erosion of experiential knowledge that eventually works on every oral tradition. The gap between hearing something and knowing it in your body. The farm debt from Lowell's medical expenses was real and recent. Cattle prices had softened in the preceding year. The timber company was offering $58,000 for a section of the property that the farm's cattle operation had never needed and could not easily use. He thought about what his father had told him about the hollow, and he applied the behavioral model that made sense to him. Large animals move when their territory is disturbed by human activity, and they return when the activity ends. He had seen bears and coyotes vacate areas where logging or construction pushed into their range and then come back when the noise stopped. He applied that model to what he believed was living in the North Hollow, and the model seemed adequate, and the money was real, and his father was 3 weeks in the ground. He signed the contract at the end of April. The timber crew arrived the first week of June 2009, 4 men and 3 machines, a feller buncher, a skidder, and a log truck, all operating under a West Virginia Division of Forestry permit on private land. They set up on the lower section of the hollow, where the terrain allowed equipment to move, and began cutting on June 9th. The logging road they used ran along the lower edge of the hollow from the farm lane. The cutting plan called for clearing the lower section of the hollow timber while leaving a buffer along the seasonal creek drainage. Legal, permitted, consistent with standard West Virginia forestry practice. The first night, nothing happened. On the second night, somewhere after midnight, the vocalizations started. Arlo was awake and heard them from the farmhouse, low-frequency sounds from the direction of the upper hollow above the cut zone, sustained in a way that did not match the pattern Lowell had described as the routine twice-yearly occurrence. These were not routine. They were continuous through most of the night, and had an urgency in the lower register that Arlo could not attribute to anything he had heard from the hollow before. He went out on the porch and listened for 40 minutes. Then he went inside and told himself the logging activity had disturbed the local wildlife and that things would settle once the crew established a rhythm. The third day, the feller buncher's hydraulic system failed. A hose had blown. The crew said it was probably worn close to the end of its service life, and these things happened on any job. They ordered a replacement from Elkins and lost most of a day. Cutting resumed on the afternoon of June 13th. That night, Arlo checked the security camera footage from the equipment shed as part of his standard routine. The camera had been there 18 months, installed after a run of equipment thefts that affected several farms in the Germany Valley area. The footage from June 13th showed nothing unusual. He went to bed. On the morning of June 14th, he found 3 of his cattle dead at the hollow fence line. They were arranged along a 20-yard stretch of the upper fence in a way that was not consistent with a panic event or a predator chase. There was no sign of disturbed or trampled ground in the pasture soil approaching the fence. The animals had walked to the fence and been killed there. The wounds matched what Emmett had documented on the heifer in July of 1962. Broken necks, clean, with portions of meat removed from the hindquarters of 2 of the 3 animals. No claw marks across the hide. No tearing, no evidence of the disorganized feeding pattern that any predator in the West Virginia wildlife inventory would leave. The kills were precise. They communicated something. Arlo spent an hour at the fence line before he called anyone. He photographed all 3 animals and the surrounding ground. He measured the positions of the carcasses relative to each other and to the fence. He examined the hollow side of the fence for track evidence and found it in the soft soil along the seasonal creek drainage. Large canid impressions, 5.5 inches in length. The stride pattern long and upright in a way that did not match any quadruped's gait. More than 1 set of tracks. At least 2 distinct individuals based on variation in track width and depth. One set was noticeably smaller than the other. He stood in the hollow mud looking at the smaller set of tracks and thought about the entry in Emmett's journal from July 9th, 1962. He went back to the equipment shed and pulled the security camera footage from the previous night. The motion sensor had triggered multiple times between 1 and 3 in the morning. What the camera captured across those triggered events were 2 large upright figures moving along the lower tree line of the hollow pasture. The camera's night mode is consumer grade, and the image quality is what that implies. Grainy. The details approximated rather than resolved. But the outlines of the 2 figures are not ambiguous. They are moving parallel to the fence, not toward the shed. Both are clearly bipedal. The size and posture of each figure is not consistent with any animal Arlo had seen on that property in 30 years of daily contact with the land. They appear across the 3 triggered events for a total of perhaps 15 seconds of footage. They are not attacking cattle in what the camera shows. The cattle are already dead by the time the camera registers their presence in the lower pasture. What they are doing, by Arlo's description after watching the footage multiple times, is patrolling. Walking the fence line with a deliberateness that distinguishes it from predator behavior, moving back and forth along the lower boundary with the systematic attention of something checking that a line is holding. He knew what he was looking at before he had finished the first playback. The word that had been waiting for him since his father's hospital room, the word he had always been able to say without fully carrying, was suddenly his to carry. Dogmen. He had just watched 2 of them on the camera screen. He called the timber company and told them the crew needed to stop work. The foreman drove up that afternoon. He examined the 3 dead cattle, looked at the fence line, studied the tracks in the hollow mud. He said it was probably a bear, or possibly coyotes working cooperatively, which does occur with whitetail. He said the crew would continue, and that wildlife disturbance of this type typically settled once the operation established a consistent presence. The contract was signed. The schedule was the schedule. He left. The crew worked June 15th. That night, the vocalizations returned at a level that was different from the previous nights, in a way Arlo found difficult to describe and has attempted several times in our conversations. Multiple voices, he said, overlapping in the low register. The vibration was physically present through the farmhouse floor in a way that previous occurrences had not been. It lasted for most of the night. He did not sleep. In the morning, before the crew arrived, he walked up to the hollow fence with Emmett's journal in his hand. He stood at the fence and read the entry from July 9th, 1962 aloud into the hollow. He cannot fully explain why he did this. He says it was the only thing that felt like an appropriate response to what he was hearing at night, and he did it anyway. By noon of June 16th, 2 more machines were down. The skidder was sitting on a tire whose sidewall had been pushed through from outside. The crew said the damage was inconsistent with road debris, too clean and too directional to be a puncture from below. The feller buncher's grapple cable had been unwound from its spool during the night and routed through the machine's undercarriage in a configuration the crew described as impossible to produce accidentally. A mechanic who examined the feller buncher several weeks later, at Arlo's request, told him that the hydraulic fitting that had failed on day 3 of the operation showed damage consistent with extremely high grip force applied to the fitting until it gave, rather than wear and tear deterioration from the inside. Both the first hydraulic failure and the cable routing bore the marks of deliberate, targeted action aimed at exactly the systems that made the machines function. By the end of June 17th, the crew was off the site. The timber company contacted Arlo a week later. The contract was terminated. They would not be returning. The advance payment was considered settled against costs the company had incurred. Arlo did not dispute the terms. The summer and fall of 2009 were the hardest months of Arlo's adult life, in a way that the practical losses, 10 cattle total across the period, all at the hollow fence, do not fully capture. The vocalizations continued through July and into August, frequent enough that broken sleep became his baseline, and he stopped expecting otherwise. His wife, who had never been given the full history of the hollow and who had understood the unfarmed upper portion of the property as simply terrain that wasn't worth developing, was frightened by what she was hearing at night and more frightened by what Arlo told her when he tried to explain. He told her everything. She believed him. The tension of those months went beyond what the events themselves imposed. The knowledge of what was in the hollow and what it was capable of was not knowledge either of them had been prepared to carry, and carrying it while trying to present a functional face to the rest of Germany Valley, to neighbors, to the bank, to the county extension agent who came by in August about a different matter entirely, was an exercise in compartmentalization that left marks. In late July, something came to the front porch of the farmhouse. Arlo woke around 2 in the morning to the sound of weight settling on old porch boards. Not footsteps, something heavier than footsteps, moving from one end of the porch to the other in a slow, deliberate traversal. He lay still and listened. The movement went the length of the porch, paused at the far end, and came back. He could feel the low-frequency vibration through the bedroom floor that he had come to associate with the hollow's most active periods. He did not get up. He did not look out the window. He lay in the dark and understood what was being communicated. The farmhouse itself was being assessed. The creatures had crossed the lower pasture and reached the residence. They were not entering. They were not damaging anything. They were locating the center of the human presence and making a specific point about what could be reached. After about 3 minutes, the porch went quiet. He did not sleep again that night. He did not tell his wife what had happened until the following afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table in daylight, which was the only setting in which the story felt like something that could be said out loud. In August, he went through Emmett's journals in full for the first time. He had read pieces of them over the years. He had skimmed the 1962 section once in his 20s, but he had never read them the way he read them in August of 2009, front to back, every entry, with the context the summer had given him pressing on every word. What came out of that reading was a picture of the hollow and its occupants across 3 decades that was richer and more specific than anything Lowell had been able to convey in conversation. Emmett had measured tracks consistently from 1962 through the late 1970s. He entered the data the same way he entered everything else, as a practical farm observation worth recording, no more or less remarkable in the journal's format than a rainfall measurement or a cattle weight. When Arlo laid those measurements out in chronological order, a pattern emerged that he had not expected. The largest track Emmett documented appeared in 1966, 4 years after the initial encounter. After that year, the largest track dimension held roughly stable through the early 1970s and then declined slightly. In the late 1970s, a new size class appeared in the records, tracks distinctly smaller than the adult measurements, appearing in areas and along routes where the smaller tracks had not appeared in the earlier years. Not a young coyote or an unusual deer track, both of which Emmett knew cold and would have identified as such. Something canid, bipedal in gait, with a smaller stride and lighter impressions than what the established adults left. A new individual. And in Lowell's own records from the 1990s, the same pattern repeated. Smaller tracks appearing alongside the established sizes in certain sections of the upper property, persisting across subsequent years with the impressions deepening and the stride lengthening incrementally as whatever was leaving them aged. The North Hollow had not been occupied by a fixed group of individuals for 47 years. It had been used as a breeding site across multiple generations. The juvenile Emmett had seen standing behind the second adult in the hollow flat area on the morning of July 8, 1962, the one that had stayed his hand from the rifle, had grown. It had reproduced. The creatures that were responding to the logging operation in June of 2009 were the descendants of the creatures that had stood at the edge of that flat area and watched Emmett put his rifle back on his shoulder. The deal Emmett had made in 1962 was not with a specific set of individuals who would eventually age and move on and be replaced by strangers. It was with a lineage, a family group that had been using the North Hollow as a denning site continuously across multiple generations, with the juveniles of one generation staying in the territory and eventually producing the next. The Hollow was not incidentally occupied. It was home in the deepest sense of the word. It had been home when Emmett's father first came to Germany Valley. It had probably been home long before that. When the timber company's feller buncher crossed the lower fence line in June of 2009 and began cutting the trees of the North Hollow, it was not disrupting a habitat. It was driving machinery into an active, multi-generation denning area. The cuts that went in during those first 4 days of the operation removed trees that had been standing over that hollow since before Emmett's family came to the valley. The response was proportional to the violation in a way that only becomes fully visible once you have the complete context. The response was measured, step by step, targeted at the machines rather than the men, directed at cattle at the fence line rather than the lower pasture where the full herd was accessible, present at the farmhouse porch without crossing the threshold. Each step communicated something more specific than the last. Each step held short of a level of violence that would have been decisive and irreversible. The escalation had the structure of a grievance being articulated, the same message delivered with increasing specificity until the message was received. Arlo built a new fence in the fall of 2009. He set it back 20 yards from Emmett's original line, giving additional ground at the hollow margin. He posted the upper property as no trespassing and told neighbors who asked that he was protecting a raptor nesting habitat in the hollow timber, which was not false. Great horned owls had nested in the hollow canopy for as long as Arlo could remember, but which was not the reason for the signs. The livestock losses ended that fall. The vocalizations continued through the following spring and then settled back into the pattern Emmett had described as normal, occasional, seasonal, not sustained. By the summer of 2010, Arlo was sleeping through the night again. The hollow felt the way it had felt before June 2009, present, watchful, but not pressing. The institutional record of what happened that summer is effectively blank. Arlo filed an agricultural predator loss claim with the West Virginia Department of Agriculture for the cattle lost during the period. The WVDA's predator loss form asks the claimant to identify the responsible predator from a specified list: black bear, coyote, domestic dog, or other. The other category triggers a follow-up process that involves a wildlife officer visiting the property to assess the damage and document the evidence. Arlo listed bear. The claim processed in 4 weeks without further contact. He did not list other, because listing other would have brought a wildlife officer to the farm in August of 2009, and having a state wildlife officer walk the hollow fence line in August of 2009, with the track evidence still fresh in the creek mud and the vocalizations continuing at night, would have led to a conversation that Arlo was not prepared to have with anyone carrying an official title. The form had no mechanism for what he needed to report, and the system that processes the form had no category for what had actually happened. So he listed bear. The form accepted it. The system moved on. The timber company's records of the equipment damage tell the same story through absence. There is no police report, no OSHA filing, no document that identifies an unclassified large predator as the cause of the hydraulic failures and cable damage. The mechanical failures were absorbed as contract costs, and the termination was logged as mutual, attributable to logistical issues beyond the original bid. Nobody at the company had a professional reason to describe what had actually happened to any external party. The alternative, absorbing the loss and moving on, was available and was chosen. This is the mechanism that keeps these encounters outside the public record. It requires no coordination and no deliberate concealment. A farmer uses the category the loss form makes available. A timber company writes off damaged equipment as a contract cost. A termination is logged as mutual. Each individual decision is rational within the framework of the person making it. The sum of those decisions is a complete suppression of the public record without anyone having decided to suppress anything. The system is not designed for what happened in the North Hollow in June of 2009, and the evidence disappears into forms and write-offs and terminated contracts, while the hollow above Germany Valley keeps what it has always kept. Arlo told me that he believed Germany Valley had other farming families with similar understandings about the upper portions of their land. He would not name them. What he described was the pattern. Sections of private land that had never been logged despite carrying timber worth harvesting. Fence lines appearing at similar elevations on different properties for no stated reason. He said, a retired agricultural extension agent who had worked the valley for close to 20 years had told him that several of the older farm families in Pendleton County had what the man called particular relationships with their upper land. Arlo knew exactly what the phrase meant. It was the language of someone who had noticed something across 2 decades of farm visits and found the most careful available words for it, careful enough to convey the observation, vague enough not to require explanation. The historical background for what is in the ridges above Germany Valley is not a short story. The Shawnee used Germany Valley and the broader Allegheny watershed as a primary hunting ground for centuries before German-speaking settlers arrived in the 1740s. Their presence in the upper Potomac country is well documented in the colonial and early Republic records, and what is also documented, though less often discussed, is the behavior of Shawnee guides traveling with European settlers through the high terrain of what is now Pendleton County. Those accounts appear in the written records of several early settler families, in letters and journals that are now held in the West Virginia State Archives and in the collections of county historical societies. What those accounts describe is behavior consistent with a deep familiarity with something in the high, hollow areas of these ridges, specific deference at certain elevations, particular sounds made when passing through specific drainages at night, and avoidance of certain areas after dark that the settlers noted as striking because the Shawnee were not afraid of the mountain terrain in any other context. The settlers interpreted this as religious practice or superstition. The more complete interpretation is that the Shawnee were applying knowledge they had developed across centuries of living in proximity to whatever occupied those ridges, and that the protocols they followed were practical rather than ceremonial. The Fort Seibert massacre of April 1758, which occurred roughly 12 miles north of Arlo's farm in what is now Pendleton County, produced survivor accounts that are held in the West Virginia State Archives. The accounts of settlers marched northward through the Allegheny terrain by their Shawnee captors include references historians have generally passed over as incidental. Avoidance of certain hollow areas at night, specific sounds made at the approach of particular ridge sections, a deference in the high ground that the prisoners could not account for. These are contemporaneous documented testimonies, not folklore. They describe people who had lived alongside something in those ridges long enough to develop automatic protocols for it, protocols that registered as notable only to observers who had no corresponding knowledge. Steve Cook recorded the legend in 1987 at a radio station in Traverse City, Michigan, as an April Fool's broadcast. He fabricated a creature he called the Michigan Dogman, invented every specific detail of its description and behavior, and broadcast the segment to fill airtime. The station received a volume of phone calls that surprised him. People recognized what he had described. People who had seen something in the northern Michigan woods that matched his invented description were calling to confirm that yes, this was real, this existed, they had seen it. Some of them, years before Cook's broadcast, gave it a name. Cook has said repeatedly that he made it all up. What the callers were recognizing was not his particular details. It was the category, and within that category, the specific behavioral and physical profile that matched what they had witnessed independently. The calls he received after that broadcast, and the years of reports that followed from across the Great Lakes region and beyond, demonstrate that the absence of a name for something does not mean the absence of the thing itself. It means the absence of a reporting framework. Cook's accident of a song provided the framework, and the accounts flooded in from people who had been carrying their observations in silence. Linda Godfrey spent 30 years building the most systematic documentation of dogman encounters that exists. Her work covers the Great Lakes states primarily, but extends into the Mid-Atlantic and Appalachian corridor, and what she identified as consistent across hundreds of independent accounts collected from people who had never heard of each other and who had no shared framework for what they were describing, is a behavioral profile that matches what Emmett documented in Germany Valley, beginning in 1962 with a precision that neither Godfrey nor Emmett could have arranged: the territorial boundary maintenance. The restraint applied when restraint achieved the desired result, the calibrated escalation in response to specific violations, the apparent awareness of human behavior and human technology, the multi-individual social structure with what appears to be family organization and juveniles protected by adults. Godfrey documented all of these across the Great Lakes states. Emmett documented all of them in Pendleton County, West Virginia, in journals that never left the family until Arlo put them in the mail to us. The two bodies of documentation are separated by 500 miles and half a century, and they describe the same behavioral profile with a consistency that independent fabrication does not produce. What Arlo returns to most consistently when he talks about the summer of 2009 is not the size of the figures on the camera footage, or the precision of the livestock kills, or the physical presence on the porch. What he comes back to is the calibration of the response. The step-by-step escalation that chose equipment over men, fence-line cattle over lower pasture herd, presence at the residence over presence inside it. Each step was the minimum intervention that communicated the maximum clarity. The timber crew was on the logging site every day during those 2 weeks. 6 men on 3 machines, accessible, vulnerable to anything willing to press into a confrontation with them directly. The creatures chose the machines instead. That choice implies an understanding of consequence. an understanding that harming a person would produce a response that harming a machine would not, and a strategic decision to apply the pressure at the level that got the result without creating a response larger than the one the creatures wanted to deal with. Arlo had spent his whole career reading animal behavior: bears, coyotes, cattle, dogs. He knew how large animals act when they feel territorial pressure or threat. What happened in the North Hollow in June of 2009 was not how any of those animals act. It had the structure of a decision made by something that understood cause and effect across a longer time frame than any animal Arlo had studied was capable of considering. In October of 2011, Arlo walked up to the new fence line at dusk. He brought nothing with him: no rifle, no camera, no phone. He stood at the fence and looked up into the hollow. The canopy above the drainage was going dark in the way October does it when the leaves are still mostly on and the shadow deepens in the hollow faster than the open sky above. He had been thinking about the entry from July 9th, 1962, about what Emmett had described doing, turning around, walking back, choosing to leave the flat area in the hollow as Emmett's territory rather than contest it. He stood at the new fence line and did the equivalent of what Emmett had done. He came to the boundary, alone, and stood there. He stood there for close to 20 minutes. He was about to turn and walk back down when he heard movement in the timber above the fence line. A figure came to the edge of the tree line. He could see the shape against the last light. Large, upright, still. It stopped at the trees and did not advance. He stood at the fence and it stood at the tree line, and neither of them moved. He estimates the distance at about 40 yards. The light was nearly gone. He could make out the outline but not the specific features. And then the figure made a sound, a low exhalation, a breath under pressure. No threat in it, no warning quality. The sound of a large animal acknowledging presence. The same description Emmett had used in the entry from July 9th, 1962. The sound from the tree line on that October evening in 2011 was functionally the same sound Emmett had heard from the flat area in the hollow nearly 50 years earlier. He stood there until the figure moved back into the timber. Then he walked home in the dark without looking behind him, the way Emmett had walked back down the hollow drainage in the summer of his 42nd year. He has not gone above the new fence line since that evening. He does not intend to. The farm is still running. Arlo is in his mid-50s. He runs a smaller herd than his father did, for reasons that are partly economic and partly about managing cattle in a way that keeps them naturally away from the upper portion of the property, without making the management pattern look deliberate to anyone casually observing the operation. The North Hollow timber, the 62 acres the timber company had contracted to cut, is standing. The trees the feller buncher fell during the first 4 days of the June 2009 operation are now 15 years of second growth, the canopy gaps closing. From the lower pasture looking up toward the ridge, the hollow shows no sign of what was attempted there. The forest has taken it back the way forest takes everything back in these mountains when the pressure is removed. Arlo has children. Before the farm passes to them, he plans to sit them down and read them the July 9th, 1962 entry from Emmett's journal. He is not willing to allow the knowledge to thin between generations the way it thinned between Lowell's hospital room and the signing of the timber contract. He knows what it costs to receive the knowledge incomplete. He will make sure his children understand it as a real and practical thing before they are old enough to file it as family story, before the distance from the experience allows the habit of following the rules to replace the understanding of what the rules are for. His grandfather wrote it down for exactly that reason. The vocalizations still come from the ridge. Twice a year, roughly, in late summer and in early fall, low and structured in the way Emmett first documented them in the 1960s. They carry through the farmhouse walls the way they always have, felt before they are consciously heard. Arlo turns off the television when they start and sits in the dark until they stop. He does not go out. He does not investigate. He listens. When they are done, he goes to bed. He has been doing this for 15 years, since the fall of 2009, when things settled back to the pattern, and it has become the kind of practice that does not require decision. It is simply what the hollow asks, and what he provides, the way Emmett provided it before him and Lowell provided it between them. They still leave deer at the hollow margin. Not every season, but regularly enough that Arlo stopped being surprised by it years ago. He finds the carcasses at the edge of the buffer zone on the hollow side of the new fence, placed in the deliberate way Emmett documented beginning in the 1960s. Clean kills, partially consumed, left at the line with a specificity of placement that rules out coincidence. He takes them away when he finds them. He considers this his portion of the arrangement, the same portion Emmett identified and maintained for 20 years of his own active farming. The exchange at the margin, the acknowledgement that the hollow and what is in it have a claim on that ground that predates any claim a deed can make. Emmett called what he established in the North Hollow in 1962 a deal. That word has traveled down the family through journal entries and conversations and Lowell's hospital room and into this account, and it is worth examining. A deal implies parties who discussed terms, who arrived at conditions through something resembling negotiation, who understood the arrangement through some common language. What Emmett established in the hollow flat area on the morning of July 8, 1962, was not any of those things. It was a moment of recognition. A man looking at a family group that was protecting its youngest member, putting his rifle back on his shoulder, and choosing to leave. The creatures looked at a man who had come into their territory with a weapon and watched him choose to walk away. Both sides registered what the other had done and understood something from it. Both sides held to that understanding for 47 years without any formal mechanism for enforcement. The word deal is Emmett's shorthand for something that does not have a better word in the vocabulary available to a cattle farmer in Pendleton County, West Virginia, in 1962, or in 2009, or now. What broke it was not cynicism. It was the gap that accumulates between knowing something and living it. Lowell carried the knowledge in his body, the way you carry something that has shaped your daily behavior for 30 years. Arlo carried it in his head, the way you carry something you have been told. That gap is not a failure of character or attention. It is what happens to oral knowledge in families where the knowledge cannot be shared outside the family, where there is no community of people who know the same things and can reinforce the knowing through regular contact. The knowledge becomes story, and story becomes rules, and rules become habit, and eventually someone inherits the habit without the understanding behind it, and makes a decision the habit was there to prevent. Emmett anticipated this. He wrote it down. Lowell tried to complete the transfer before he ran out of time. The transfer was incomplete, and the cost was 10 cattle and 3 months of fear, and something between Arlo and his wife that required years to fully address. But the knowledge is complete now. Arlo has it in his body. He will make sure his children have it the same way before the land comes to them. The North Hollow is up there above the new fence line, dark and dense and continuous with the Monongahela National Forest that runs unbroken from the ridge top through terrain that goes for miles without a road. Whatever is in it is carrying forward the knowledge of that piece of ground across more generations than any record the family has can document. The fence holds. The buffer zone is maintained. The exchange at the margin continues in the pattern Emmett established in the summer of his 42nd year. And when the vocalizations come down from the ridge in late summer, finding their way through the farmhouse walls the way they have for as long as anyone in that family can remember, Arlo sits in the dark and listens and holds to his side of something his grandfather called a deal, which is close enough to right, which is what the hollow has always required from the people farming in its shadow, and which is what he intends to keep giving it, for as long as the land is his to hold.